So I just beat the Guardians of the Galaxy game, and surprisingly, I really liked it. If you've explored other content I've made on this channel, you'd know that my general disposition toward a lot of the modern Marvel games, sans the Insomniac Spider-Man games, I've generally thought that every Marvel game since Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite has just completely missed the mark on what makes Marvel comics, film, and other media special. Most of these titles lacked inspiration or faithfulness to the source material, and really just served as shallow facsimiles of what the Marvel Cinematic Universe counterparts offered. And they really only served as promotional tie-ins to the films as a way to ride the hype of the MCU, you know, one of the most popular entities in media right now. These titles lacked identity separate from the film adaptations and felt like cash grabs rather than passion projects. There's a reason why I always referred to Square Enix Avengers game as the Bevengers, and that's because the cast present in Marvel's Bevengers feels like the cheap Chinese knockoff version of their MCU counterparts, stripping all of the iconography and any meaningful bit of backstory or character trait that draws people to these characters, and leaving in their stead the bare minimum aspects of these heroes that anyone gets at first glance. It's all flash, no substance. On top of that, these games also aped gameplay formulas from other more popular franchises without putting the needed depth or actual fun into a shallow attempt to ride the coattails of gaming trends. Bevengers was a bad Destiny clone, and don't even get me started on Midnight Suns. That game looks like it's guaranteed to be a train wreck. Does the Guardians of the Galaxy game fix that, though? Does it capture the essence of Guardians in a way that other recent Marvel titles fail to? Is it a wholly original game with a ton of love and references to the comics and material that came before? Well, no, not really, but it does everything that the games prior tried to do, but much better, and really that's better than nothing. Something I've never mentioned on the channel, despite my nerding out of comic books, is that the James Gunn Guardians of the Galaxy film is probably my favorite comic book film adaptation ever. It completely takes its liberties with the source material. In fact, it morphs the story of the Guardians into one entirely separate in tone and delivery from that of the comics. All of the references to 80s music and culture never really existed until the films. The quirky, snappy humor was never a thing until the films. The Guardians we know and love now were completely different characters before the films. Drax wasn't an aloof meathead. In fact, he wore a cape and was pretty much like a wizard. Rocket wasn't a snarky asshole. Quill wasn't a cocky and lovable goofball. But the Guardians of the Galaxy weren't some ragtag group of broke mercenaries who were considered a joke by the galaxy overall. And there were various other Guardians that the films never introduced with an entirely different origin story. All of that only exists because of the films, and these are changes that I loved because it offered something new and relatable to grip onto with the Guardians that made them more than just a super group of powerful aliens. And while I doubt you really need me to say it, but this game obviously draws a majority of its inspiration from the James Gunn films, with not a whole lot of its own original ideas. But hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Last and definitely least, Peter Jason Quill.
That's it? That's all you wrote? It was a character limitation.
Now, despite me enjoying what this game had to offer, I won't say the experience I had was perfect. Far from it, in fact, and there are some overall gripes I'd say I have with the direction of the title and of these AAA Marvel games that are loosely tied to the MCU, but I'll get into that later. Before I get into the problems I had, I actually kind of want to focus on what I liked first and foremost, since I want to emphasize that I really did like this game. If there was one word I'd use to describe the Guardians of the Galaxy game, it's jovial. The game doesn't really take itself seriously, and its brand of humor and delivery honestly felt charming and on point a lot of the time.
Scoff. What did you say?
I said scoff.
You don't say scoff, you just scoff.
The thing I'd say the title nails the most is its ambience, provided by the charming and lighthearted writing, and the characters married with the brilliant score of 80s music. Honestly, nothing got me more pumped than doing a huddle with the cast, rounding them together with a corny motivational speech, only to have Everyone's a Winner by Hot Chocolate blaring in the background, or, you know, to get rickrolled during the final boss, which was probably my highlight of the game. I also love the game's various references and willingness to explore the extended cast and lore of the comics instead of just sticking to what people are familiar with. Having Cosmo the Space Dog, Lady Hellbender, and the World Mind, Adam Warlock, who in reality will likely be making an MCU appearance in the third Guardians film anyway, and even Nikki Gold is refreshing to see. And I thought it was particularly impressive that all of these characters that had never made an actual MCU appearance didn't feel out of place at all. Adam Warlock fit in with the cast perfectly, and it honestly makes me hope the MCU adaptation of him meshes just as well as this version does with the cast.
Crew.
Did he take my room?
The thing that drew me to this cast of Guardians was honestly that they felt so familiar to the film adaptations of the characters in a way that was endearing and actually did capture what makes them special. Watching this cast of Guardians interact with each other felt like revisiting old friends. The uncanniness that something like Avengers Left Behind was long gone. These characters felt real, and although there weren't too many differences in their original demeanor from their MCU counterparts, what was in place in their performances was a worthy substitute. The story itself is also a wholly original, well-placed narrative that offered new sides to these characters that I genuinely appreciated, taking a lot of liberties to make it feel special. So, this is another spoiler warning. If you do not want to be spoiled on the events of Guardians of the Galaxy, the video game released in 2021, I would click off the video now and, just go and buy the game and play it if you haven't. So, don't say I didn't give you a fair warning. It's a lot of the small things in the story and universe that make it special. For example, in this game it's mentioned that Drax was the one to kill Thanos, and during a lengthy mission where you pretty much explore his psyche, you learn that he's still haunted by Thanos to this day, and his death never really rectified the pain that he continues to feel with the loss of his wife and daughter. One of the main plot points that I loved in this game was Peter Quill having to come to grips with the fact that he might be Nikki Gold's father, which was a nice twist that I really wasn't expecting. His inner turmoil in trying to take responsibility as a potential parent is only made more bittersweet when Nikki becomes the matriarch for Magus and the Universal Church of Truth, who's using her to essentially brainwash the entire galaxy into a cult by promising to give those who follow it what they desire most. On a side note, one of the more creative liberties I love from this story is that Nikki kind of gains her powers Captain Marvel style by getting the essence of the Soul Stone, which is again a neat twist compared to her honestly dull comic origin story of just being from Mercury. Overall, the plot is something I could see happening in the next Guardians film, or anyone for that matter. The Universal Church of Truth is a great threat to introduce the Guardians to, and the progression of the plot feels natural and well-paced. The last thing I want to mention is that out of all of the characters in this game, the one I loved the most was Mantis. They just turned her into some cryptic gypsy psycho that's almost a mesh of both her comic and film adaptations, and I love how nonchalant and weird she is. She was honestly my favorite character in this game, and I kinda wish she played a bigger role overall. Now, with all that said, I appreciate that the MCU has opened up these comic stories to a wider audience, and the changes that have been made honestly feel fitting. But this game does exacerbate the overall issue I have with these recent Marvel games, and that's how much they shamelessly draw from the MCU with very little alterations at all. Like, you could have told me that Bradley Cooper reprised his role as Rocket and I would have believed you. In fact, all of these Guardians are pretty much one-for-one matches with their Hollywood counterparts, and that's a bit grating when you're like me and you're looking for something new to latch onto from the license wherever you can. Sure, the characters will look a little bit different from their, Marvel Cinematic Universe live-action counterparts, but the personalities match up pretty much one for one, and it wouldn't necessarily be an issue if I didn't have that form of media to consume and to kind of link up with anyway. At times, it kind of just feels like a cheap knockoff of what the James Gunn films had to offer, and it's hard to shake that feeling when the game constantly gives impressions and makes allusions to these movies. And when I'm sitting down playing this game and something happens that makes me think, damn, I really want to watch Guardians of the Galaxy, it just kind of takes me out of the experience. But overall, I'd say that this game is the closest example Marvel has given to capturing the fun essence of the MCU into one of their games, even if the end result is a bit reductive and lacking in wholly original ideas and inspiration. There were also some minor problems I had with the delivery of the story too. I felt the game really glossed over Gamora and her internal struggles and developments in the game. She has this quick 5-minute freak out when she sees the church manipulating a kid, and then immediately comes to some grand resolution like 3 minutes later, and this is despite Drax having a whole 1 hour plus long story mission devoted to his backstory with Thanos and his family. I also wasn't a fan of how some things just kinda happened without any real explanation as to why. Like, why was Adam Warlock just sitting in this cave until now? It was never really explained because everyone assumed he was dead, and the whole thing just kind of seemed a little confusing to me, like they just stuffed him in there last second. And why does it take this long for Quill's blasters to get these new powers, and why has no one questioned them until now? They're honestly kind of treated like a joke, but his Spartoy background here is one of the most interesting things in this game because it differs from both the comics and film. So learning more would have been cool, but whatever. Also, Star-Lord's background as a former war criminal and vigilante and soldier is briefly mentioned from time to time, but I would have loved to get more background on his involvement in the Annihilation War, but I digress. The other big issue I have with this game is actually its gameplay. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate it per se, I just thought it also exemplified the issue I have with this game feeling like a cheap knockoff. The game essentially is a watered down Mass Effect. It has dialogue choices like Mass Effect, the combat loop is like Mass Effect, you control your teammates like you do in Mass Effect, it just lacks the depth and intricacies that the gameplay of Mass Effect does. There's very little lasting consequences for your actions as Star-Lord. The selection of abilities and attacks from your character is severely limited, and for the most part you're just going to be mindlessly shooting drones of enemies in small arenas over and over and over again with very little variation. It was probably the most egregious part of the game, honestly. There's very little customization. In fact, it's kind of the illusion of customization, because by the end of the game, as long as you're decent at exploring things, you're going to end up finding everything to get all the upgrades anyway. The gameplay loop just felt dull, and by the end I was fighting wave after wave of enemies and nearly endless gauntlets. I just wanted it to be over. The choices you make here will often lack impact too. Sure, there are a few key moments that will alter some missions and gameplay events slightly, like choosing to sell Rocket or Groot to Lady Hellbender, or managing to convince the World Mind to stay in the galaxy after the church takes over, but more times than not, the game's choices really amount to a dialogue choice or two being altered and a trophy or achievement being unlocked. At the end of the day, it was the interactions between the characters and my willingness to see the story come to a conclusion that got me through the game. The gameplay more so felt like a backdrop, meant to get me from point A to point B. The puzzles never really felt like puzzles, they felt more just like traversal elements. The combat felt one-dimensional and a bit stale by the end, didn't really progress and evolve in a way that I thought was meaningful, and overall it just kind of felt like the gameplay was almost an aftersight, which was a bit unfortunate. At best, it was a serviceable distraction between cutscenes. At worst, it was a mindless slog that drew me out of the experience. Overall, my consensus on Square Enix and Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy was that it was pretty good. Was it perfect? No. Do I think it's worth your time and money? Maybe. If you're like me and you love the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, you'll probably find enjoyment in this game. But if you've been wary because of the track record of previous Marvel games and Guardians really isn't your thing, I doubt this game will do a whole lot to convert you into a believer.